Hi, my name's Cecilia Poullain, and welcome to this episode of Brave New Women. All around the world, there are amazing, ordinary women doing extraordinary things. Brave New Women is about giving those women a platform and a voice, and it's about changing the way that women are perceived, and it's a way of inspiring all of us to do the things that we've always wanted to do. I'm so pleased to be sitting down today to talk to Susi Prescott. Susi lived on the North Shore of Sydney with her husband and 4 children for many, many years. And then suddenly, to her surprise, her marriage stopped. And for her, that was it was a shock, but it was also a moment where it precipitated her into moving overseas, initially to Rwanda and then Nepal. And then finally she settled in Peru for 12 years, and she was teaching at a school called Colegio Elohim. I hope I've got my pronunciation right.
Perfect.
And then from those experiences in Peru, she wrote 2 books, which were really memoirs. One was called Where Hummingbirds Dance, and that was published in 2017. And the second one, called Beyond the Priest's Cottage, was published in June 2020. And today I'd like to particularly focus on Susi's experiences in Peru and the work she did at the school there. So Susi, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Cecilia.
So Susi, let's just go back to that moment in your life, which I imagine was pretty stressful and pretty shocking when your marriage was suddenly stopped. What state were you in at that moment, and what was it that made you want to go overseas then?
Well, if I may, I'd like to read an extract from my memoir, Where Hummingbirds Dance. There it is, because it expresses it, I think, in the best way. It just expresses the best way how I was feeling. My husband left one evening, and this is what happened. At dawn the next day, I stood at the bedroom window watching the frangipani tree take on its colours in the emerging daylight. An image 2 decades old appeared of our oldest daughter, Katie, aged 3, in an apple green dress, sitting beside her dad on the low outside wall. The backs to me, the pair surveyed several tied bundles of weeds that were ready for collection after the weekend's gardening. Katie's soft, fair waves danced as she swung her legs and turned her little face up to his, asking, "When will the garbage truck come, Daddy?" He smiled at her and answered, "Tomorrow morning." "Can we wait for it?" "Okay." As I stared at the same wall, now much higher and part of an enclosed courtyard, Richard's words from the day before returned when he left. "Be brave." A flame of defiance surged within me. I had 2 choices. I could stay in Sydney, clinging to the raft of my former life, or I could follow another path. My mind hurtled backwards to bedtime stories with my father, his English actor's voice enthralling me with tales of travels as a young Royal Naval officer in the last flush of the British Empire, or reading from books, Rudyard Kipling, set in the fevered jungle nights of colonial India, and legends of Pegasus, the winged horse, and the terrible Minotaur. Next, I was 12, in a stuffy school assembly hall, watching slides shown by visiting missionaries of their work in the outback, as my imagination lifted me up and away into another world of intense heat, stunted eucalypts, and red dust beneath an endless blue sky. Then my thoughts lurched forward into a fantasized future, and I saw a single, strong, independent woman in Africa or India, I wasn't quite sure which, in a wide-brimmed hat with sandals, scooping out rice for hungry families, or sitting on the dirt in a grass hut with a class of skinny children, a pioneer helping the needy, speaking their language, even giving the odd TV interview on the job when CNN or BBC World braved the journey to visit. Susi, have you completely lost your mind? Your husband left you 12 years ago. What are you thinking? I crumpled on the window ledge. my head in my hands.
Mm.
So that kind of explains the state that I was in, the dreams that I had, and the opportunities that I could already see despite my terrible distress. And with my vivid imagination pulling me forwards, that's how it happened.
Mm. So I can hear that in that moment there was the distress, but there was also, even at that time, immediately you were saying, it was almost like you hit the bottom and then suddenly it was, and this is opening a door for me at the same time.
Yes.
So.
I'd always had dreams of making a difference. I can remember I used to watch the 7:00 news while I was preparing dinner for the family in my kitchen, which had everything that opened and shut in it. And I'd look with distress at scenes such as I've just described, these dreadful famines and war-torn strife and refugees. And I think, I want to be doing something. I want to be making a difference somewhere. And then their microwave would beep, and I'd go back to my cooking and my dinner for the children. And there was nothing I could do about it. But so I'd always had these yearnings deep down. And suddenly one door slammed shut and another one started to open.
Mm. And I feel like there are so many of us who have those desires to make a difference. And then, as you say, the microwave beeps. And
yes,
that's the end of it.
Yes.
So then you initially went to Rwanda and Nepal.
Yes, Nepal and Rwanda, yes.
In that order, so Nepal first,
yes.
And then Rwanda. And then you decided to go to Peru. So can you tell me about that decision?
Well, actually, I decided to go to Peru before I went to Nepal and Rwanda. Nepal and Rwanda were sort of detours, which happened because of connections that I had through the college where I worked. But again, if I may, I would quite like to read you something else, if you wouldn't mind.
I'd love it. I'd love it if you'd read it.
Again, the decision in Peru, 6 months after my husband left me, I went on a trekking holiday with some friends, a small group of friends, to Peru. And we ended up, our final trek was in an area called Azangate, which was a real wilderness Andes area, southwest of Cusco. This is what happened. I'll read you from here. So the trek took us through a landscape of harsh, unforgiving beauty, slopes of purplish brown dusted with green, streams rushing down wide valleys, and turquoise lakes brooding crystal clear. Always near, the mighty peaks of Azangate loomed, their snow blinding in the morning sunshine, menacing in the bone-chilling sleet of afternoon. Passes of shale and scree at 5,200 metres took every ounce of strength and left us gasping, choking with tears of exhaustion. Avalanches exploded from icy, churned glaciers, and one afternoon the wind howled so fiercely it threatened to lift our tent. I cowered inside with my companion, trying to grab the soaking nylon and hold it down, our yells bringing the porters out into the storm to readjust the guy ropes. On clear nights, the temperature dropped to minus 15 degrees, the inky sky filling with spectacular stars. We climbed higher to areas too isolated for a village, yet locals would appear from nowhere. More than once, as I organised myself in the tent, I turned to see 6 or 7 pairs of eyes peering in. Outside, an entire family would be waiting, a proud man wearing the traditional beanie with ear flaps, colourful rug over his shoulders, his wife in a woolen blouse, multi-layered skirt and long dark plaits, often carrying a sleeping baby in a blanket on her back, plus children of various ages, every one a small replica of the parents. One freezing morning at our highest camping site, I left the trekker's breakfast tent replete and snug in my hooded down jacket, fleece tracksuit, gloves and boots to find a little boy standing on the icy ground outside. He wore sandals, a pair of pajama pants and a worn knitted cardigan. He gazed up at me from under a battered brimmed hat, his face solemn, his cracked lips unmoving. Kneeling down on the frost, I remembered the right Spanish words to ask him his name. His reply came as barely a murmur in my ear. Salvador. Our tour guide had been watching and fetched some books and pencils. I handed them over to the boy, and he wrapped his arms carefully around them, a gleam of pleasure lighting his deep brown eyes. He shivered as a stiff breeze stirred. I reached out to hug him close, inhaling his scent of wood fire and soil. Squinting up at the snowy mountain range, I felt again that flicker of defiant optimism. There in the Peruvian Andes, I made up my mind to leave my old path and head out into a new world, wherever the path might take me.
It's so evocative. I mean, I can see the mountains. I can see the shale that you're walking up, the difficulties of it, the cold. I can feel the cold, and it's beautifully done, and explains so well that decision.
And so I just thought, no, that I'm going to come back. And so via Nepal and Rwanda, that's just what I did.
And so you came back to Peru, and where were you in Peru? How did that happen?
On that trip, that trekking trip, having made this momentous decision, the next thing, because I'm not only am I very imaginative, I'm also very practical. So as soon as we got into Arequipa, I remember sitting by the fountain in the Plaza de Armas, the square, and watching little children sort of playing in the water of the fountain and thinking, I could live here. This is where I'll live. Again, completely impractical, although not so, because thoughts like that have entered my head in other places like Provence in France and various other locations. But my common sense has always said, don't be ridiculous. You've got 4 children and a husband. You could never do this. But of course, now I didn't have the husband and the 4 children were growing up. And so suddenly my imagination said, okay, right, well, you're going to do it then. And once I've set myself a challenge like that, there's no going back. So
this was on the first trip, was it?
Yes, when I my very first trip to Peru. And so I raced up to I said to someone in the hotel, where do I find out about teaching English? Because I thought, I'm a French teacher. Well, they don't speak French there. So obviously the only thing I can do is teach English. And so I got the name of a local language institute and went up there and made inquiries and got all the necessary details. And that was where I originally intended to work. And that's where I did originally work, because I would never have left Australia, given up my regular teaching job and left without some employment to go to. I mean, I would now, but I wouldn't have then, because I didn't understand how easy it was to get to pick up work in that field. But at the time, I thought I had to have a proper official job. So I went over and taught in this institute for middle class, wealthy parents and for their children, ambitious for their children, and realised very quickly that wasn't at all what I left to do. And so I started the search to find something more worthwhile.
Mm-hmm. And so just let me get the timing all right in this. So you went to Peru initially. When
Yes.
was that?
I went to Peru. My husband left in October 2005. I went to Peru in April. I left on April Fool's Day, 2006, and I was there for 6 weeks. And that's when I made this decision and went and got this information. And then 2006 was the year that my daughter was doing her HSC. So I came home and stayed put for that whole year. And meanwhile, at my college, a connection came up in Nepal through my college, and I met a headmaster, and I said, "Would you like me to come and train your teachers in teaching English as a volunteer?" And so he's jumped up and down and said, "Yes, please." And so when my daughter left for schoolies on the same day, I got on a plane for Kathmandu, and off I went. And that was at the end of 2006.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then when did you come back to Peru?
So that was 2006. Then I came back to Australia for a short period, resigned my job, and then headed off to Rwanda, which was another contact through my school, where I spent 3 months training teachers in French, and that was living on the top of a hill in the southwest rural region, where there was just nothing. There were no cars. There was nothing. It was just wonderful. And I would hike up the hill through the mud every day with my hiking boots on, up to the school with my tape recorder, because it was tape recorders in those days, my battery run tape recorder, to play to these children in this school with no glass in the windows. And they had never seen anything like me. They just did not know what to make of me with my songs and my dancing. And I taught them and trained the teachers. I did teacher training sessions in French and English. And then I came back when was it? July. I came back in July of 2007, yes. And then contacted Peru because I'd heard nothing from them. I thought, I'd better see what's going on. And they said, we're expecting you at the end of the month.
Goodness.
So I jumped onto a plane and went off to Peru in August. I arrived there on the 30th of August 2007.
Mm-hmm. And so you were working in the school for middle-class families.
Yes, it was like an adult education centre, really. But I very quickly realised that wasn't what I'd signed up for. So I was living in a hostel, and there were a lot of young people there. I met so many fabulous young people, all the same age as my children. And one of them was a particularly special girl, and she was looking for volunteer work. And she could speak Spanish. I couldn't. I could only speak French, and I was busily studying Spanish from my grammar books. And she found a reference. No, I found a reference to Colegio Elohim in a pamphlet in a shop, which said that if anybody had old clothes, they would be happy to donate them to this school. So I found that, and my friend rang up some people who at the time were associated with the school, and she went out and found it, and she told me about it, and then she took me out, and she moved on, and I stayed.
Mm. And so what was your very first impressions of the school when you went out there?
Oh, gosh, I think I need to read that to you as well, but I might just have to find it. Here we are. So we set off on the combi. I'll call this isn't her real name, but I'll call her Jen. We set off on the combi together, she taking me out to this school. So I'll read, all right? We boarded the battered grey combi. This is in town. Fleets of these minivans, usually owned by private companies, run an exhaustive network of complex routes all over the city and surrounds, competing with several thousand taxis to provide the main forms of communal transport in Arequipa. They have seats for about 20 and standing room for as many commuters as can be physically squashed inside. Remember, this is very much pre-COVID. And while some vehicles are relatively new and well maintained, this one had seen far better days. We each found a seat and fell into it as the combi took off. Black exhaust belching, salsa blaring from the radio. This is the wonderful thing about Arequipa. There's just music everywhere. I noticed several passengers crossing themselves, nervous, doing the genuflection, nervous, I suppose, given the crazy speed, until I realised it happened every time we passed a church. We round through the congested streets, our conductor, a young woman in jeans and jumper, calling out to stop the driver as she hauled open the door for passengers getting on or off, then pushed it shut again. The uniformed students and suited professionals gradually disembarked, and as we reached the dry limits of town, nylon tracksuits wedged in around us. From my seat, I observed wind-roughened faces, many missing several teeth. An earthy smell intensified when they slammed the windows shut against choking dust as the asphalt road petered out. We stopped, and the conductor, a slight girl, heaved at a rotund elderly lady to get her up the steps, a mamacha, part of an older generation of women which still dressed traditionally. A black hat perched upon her head, thick grey braids snaking down her back, woolen stockings below full petticoats. She propelled her substantial behind onto the front seat as a youngster dived off it. The combi crunched its gears and began to climb, and through the grimy window I saw piles of bricks and stones, half-dug foundations and one-room dwellings by the dirt road. We'd begun the grind up into the parched foothills of the volcano, locally nicknamed its skirts. On a corner, a woman in jeans stirred bubbling pots on a coal fire. The combi slowed and the conductor leapt off to fetch 2 plastic plates loaded with meat, rice and potatoes. She balanced them on the dashboard in the sun, and I caught a whiff of spicy deep fry as we took off again, both dishes somehow staying put. The van wound even higher, past steep ravines, choked with rubbish, hurled out in the baking sun. Inside the combi, heat turning fetid, it crossed my mind to leap up, shout to get off, and fall through the door into the open air before jumping onto the next vehicle out of there. Then through the bottoms, I spotted Jen in her seat with a tiny girl on her lap, beribboned pigtails bobbing as she laughed. I pulled myself together, grateful to have my young companion to show me the way in the packed combi to the last stop and whatever waited there. By the time we got to the end of the line, only Jen and I remained on board. We climbed out into the dusty road, littered with garbage, building rubble, rusty tins, mongrels and their feces. A pack of males snapped and growled at each other as they circled to take their turn and mount a cowering bitch with teats still enlarged from the last litter. I stared, recalling the fashion excesses I'd seen lavished upon the city counterparts of these mangy, half-starved creatures. We skirted around them and tried to focus straight ahead. In places, the unmistakable smell of human waste hung in the air. Puffing uphill, we passed shacks made of blocks hacked out of volcanic rock, their tin roofs held down by stones, on plots surrounded by boulders heaped into piles. Some had neatly swept dust yards strung with faded, fluttering colours, clothes drying in minutes under the desert sun. We came across a communal tap with several large plastic buckets lined up in front of it, waiting for the water truck. How could anybody even lift them once they've been filled, let alone carry them home? I gasped. I suppose the women do it, Jen replied, watching as a mother with a baby tied on her back approached down a treacherous steep track with 2 empty jerry cans, which she dumped in the queue. Jen spoke briefly to her and waved as she left. They do, she whispered, and the water truck comes every 3rd day with a total weekly ration of 8 buckets for cooking, cleaning and washing. It's supposedly fit to drink, but everybody has parasites. Plodding on up the stony track, I thought of the grim conditions of life in the mountains I'd witnessed trekking the Azangate range. The stone huts at 4,500 metres, with crops in the frozen soil and small flocks of sheep, minded all day by tiny shivering children like Salvador. In the shacks surrounding me, people lived people who had turned their backs on that tradition to take their chances in the desert outskirts of the city, where at least the combi could take them to markets, hospitals and schools. I tried to imagine the view on the first morning of the settlement I now walked through, a cluster of hopeful flimsy blue tents flapping forlornly in the breeze, clinging to the steep crumbling hillside. No water, no power, no shelter, nothing but hot, burning sun in the dry season, torrential rains in the wet, and always frigid night winds. We're here, said Jen, breaking into my thoughts. At the top of a rise, we'd reached a wall painted with a map of the world. Young voices began singing on the other side, ringing out in the desert silence. Once they had finished, we pushed open the high metal gate and stepped into a small courtyard covered with green shadecloth and brightly painted with numbers and words. At least 100 children's faces, just like those I had seen in Azangate 18 months before, turned to us from a sea of ragged uniforms and street clothes. A woman stepped forward, wearing a neatly pressed trouser suit and leather shoes free of dust. I glanced down at my scruffy pants and runners and up again as a smiling, serene face, framed by long, wavy black hair, leaned to kiss my cheek. She turned to the assembly and announced in Castellano, Señorita Jen has brought a new visitor today. And so I found Rosa and Colegio Elohim in the slum of Héroes del Cenepa.
Goodness. So it was really absolutely in the slums. I mean, I can...
Totally. It's changed since then. Now they have running water, but they still only have cold, and it's one tap per house, and usually in the yard. But there's no sewerage. There's still shacks, sort of half-built. It's still, the roads are still dust. The area has expanded. There are so many more shacks, just expanding and expanding, getting closer and closer and closer to the volcano. Massive volcano called El Misti, which overlooks Arequipa. Well, there are 3 volcanoes actually, but that one is the massive one. It's almost 6,000 meters, I think, and these slums are encroaching up into its foothills, and it's incredibly dangerous.
So it's still an active volcano.
Oh yes, it's still it hasn't erupted since 1600, but it is still classed as active. Yes.
Wow. Gosh. So that's just a disaster waiting to happen.
Afraid so.
So after that first day, when Rosa kissed your cheek, I think that's lovely.
Yes. Oh, that's what they do. Not at the moment because of COVID, but yes, it's always a big kiss on the cheek. Yes.
So then, what were your thought processes then?
Well, I thought I was so thrilled because I'd found exactly what I was looking for. A little school which needed me. I offered to teach them English. I offered an English program for the primary, and they were absolutely delighted. And so every afternoon, or 3 afternoons a week, I started going out. 3 mornings a week, I started going out to teach English to the years 3 to 6. And then in the afternoon, I'd go to my paid job. And after 2 years, I gave up the paid job and concentrated exclusively on Colegio Elohim.
And so this was all voluntary?
Yes. Oh, yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. And everybody moved on except me, and Rosa and I became very firm friends. And it was the following year, I think, in the middle of the wet season, when Rosa, I went up up in the mud to see them during the holidays, and because the dust turns to mud in the wet season, which is January and February when it rains. And Rosa was sweeping out there are only 2 little classrooms, and Rosa was sweeping one of them out. And she said to me, Miss Susi, she always called me Miss Susi, I'd like to talk to you. So she sat me down with the 2 other principal teachers, and they pointed out the second story, which was just literally a layer of bricks, and never got further than that. It was kind of a swimming pool in the rain. And they just said, look, we've run out of money. Can you help us raise some money? And then that was when I thought, all right, I found my project. And so I made a promise to myself. I said, I will do everything I can. And I made a promise that as long as they needed me, I would be there. And that's how it all started.
And so did you help them raise money for the...
Oh, I've been raising money for years. I came home and had a big fundraiser down our local bowling club. I wrote my first book and sold that at the fundraiser, and I had a silent auction, and all the local, it was lovely, the local shops around where I live, and so that was all combined with my Peru project, and we raised enough money to put on the second story, just a very small second story. And then after that, I had another one which put the roof on. So every time I came back to Australia, I'd have a fundraiser. And then I started fundraising online. It's a huge struggle. Fundraising is a terrible struggle. And I have a dedicated band of helpers who help me as much as they can. And yes, it's just an ongoing thing, really, and raising money. The school has grown and raising money for the teachers' salaries, and yes, so and applying for grants over both here and over there, all in Spanish. Never with much success, any success actually, but that's basically. Yes, I became Rose's right-hand person and joined, and we set up a committee and doubled the size of the school, and I trained teachers in Spanish. And I trained them with Australian methodologies and so on, and outcomes and all that sort of thing that we do here in Australia that, we'd introduced to here 15 years ago, but over there it was all quite, it's quite revolutionary. So I was able to sort of help with that. So, yes, so we became a bit of a team.
Mm. And what was different teaching there compared to your teaching position in Australia?
Oh heavens, where could I start? Well, I mean, the landscape for a start. I would stand in the classroom, the new classroom that we'd built on the second floor, and I'd look out at this sort of wasteland of desert with these little shacks, and then this massive great volcano just sort of literally there. Sometimes it had snow on it, and I'd think, I can't believe this, compared to a private school in Sydney. The whole, what else? I was teaching English, obviously, instead of French. Some things remain the same, the passion of teaching and the method of teaching. But the cultural gaps were huge. Trying to understand, I think also trying to imagine and understand the homes that these children came from. And I did go and visit some of them, and they were just shocking. It was just such a shock. Well, no, it wasn't a shock because I knew what they looked like from the outside, but going in just confirmed that they were even worse inside than they were outside, and that these children and their parents lived in these conditions and yet still managed to front up to school. It was just, I don't know how they did it. I was so full of admiration for them and the conditions, the physical conditions, let alone the abuse and the alcoholism and the emotional conditions that they lived in. I know that, I work with marginalised kids here now in Sydney, and I know that there are huge problems as well. But I think it was the fact that these children endure such appalling physical conditions on top of everything else. And the tragedy is that none of these kids that I taught and loved dearly in the slums in Peru, none of them will ever see a psychologist or a psychiatrist or any sort of counsellor. They will just never, ever see them because there's no help for them in Peru like there is here. There's nothing like the network of help that there is available for them. There's no Disabilities Act. The ignorance of the parents is staggering. And it's been described as almost an aggressive ignorance. It's an ignorance they can become very aggressive, and they think they know better than we do what their children need, when they really, unfortunately, that they can't read or write themselves, and they sort of listen to hearsay, and they're very easily manipulated. Yes, it was a very, very difficult environment sometimes to work in. But we stuck in and we remained there always. And Rosa and her team, it's always for the sake of the children.
Mm. And so I'm hearing that the children had there are a lot of psychological issues with the children because of
huge. Yes, the mental health of the children. There was just no. There was no hazarding what they were going through. There was alcoholism, appalling alcoholism. There was violence. There was the macho element as well with the fathers. There was mothers, with children to several different fathers, and the stepkids, of course, living in the same place would tend to cop it. I went. Personally, one of the saddest things I ever experienced was when we went en masse, the whole of year 6 filed down from the school through the dust and the dirt, through the labyrinth of huts into a little shack where there was the open coffin of one of the little boys who'd been in year 6 and his father. And the father it had been a murder-suicide. The father had killed his son and himself out of complete desperation, because he'd been told his daughter had been taken away to a refuge. The mental health issues there, well, I mean, they're just mind-boggling, literally, and yet there was absolutely no recognition, no help of any sort for him, and that was the result.
Oh, gosh.
Gosh. So it's a very, very, very different situation.
Yeah.
And mind you, this isn't all of Peru. This is the slums. I mean, there's a very affluent and very ambitious middle class that lives in Arequipa, and their children go to expensive private schools, and they have the best education that money can buy. And I'm sure they have access to everything that they would need. But we're talking about the slums here. And 75% of Arequipa's population lives in the slums. 25% lives in the centre of that town.
Gosh. And what have you followed any of the children that you taught?
Yes.
So what happens to them after they leave the school?
Well, when I say, oh yes, I thought you meant throughout the school, through their school life, I've very much followed them while they're still at school. And one thing I must say that we're terribly proud of is our secondary school. Its first graduation happened this year, and we've got 3 girls applying for university, which is really, really thrilling. Not only are they slum kids, but they're also girls, and we're just thrilled. They're wonderful, wonderful girls, and they've always worked so hard against the most incredible odds, and they have really, got there. So we're thrilled with that. Many of them, unfortunately, drop off along the way, fall into the same patterns as their parents. Where their children come to the school, they have teenage pregnancies. The motto of the program that is run there is empowerment through education, giving children an alternative to teenage pregnancy and a life of crime. But unfortunately, many of them still fall into teenage pregnancy and a life of crime. And all of these, many of these are in this book, the stories of what happens to these children, and also some of them in this one as well, the sort of follow-up. It's difficult to... some of them have gone on to... One girl already went to university, and she's studying town planning, which is absolutely amazing. And her mother funded her through selling drinks at the market, and she would sit beside her mother and sell them. From kindergarten up, she'd sit beside her mother and sell, and that's how her mother funded her through the very small amount that she had to pay us for a very small enrolment amount and books and so on, because we'd get no funding from the government, so we have to ask for whatever the parents can give, really, in order to inculcate some sort of responsibility, and also to get some sort of funds to help with all the expenses. We've got kids who've gone to technical college. I think we've got one who's become a teacher. The problem is that once they leave, we lose them in the slum jungle. It's really hard to keep up with them because they move. They'll have an auntie over in Cusco or something, and so they'll go off to Cusco, or they'll go off to Lima, or they'll go off to somewhere else. So it's actually very difficult. But often they'll come back. They'll come back and visit us, and then we'll find out what's happened to them all. But so some of them, maybe 50% have made a change. The other 50 have just fallen straight back into the same tragic lifestyles.
Still, 50% is a massive...
Roughly, I'd say maybe roughly, yes, roughly.
I mean, that's making a massive change in those...
I hope so, yeah.
In those children's lives. I mean, I think that's fantastic.
Yes. I mean, that's that's a very rough estimate, but many of them. Well, I mean, they've gone on to secondary school. We only were able to run our secondary school for the 5 years. We have to close it now because we just don't have the funds to keep it going. But most of the children now go on to secondary school somewhere, so that's a huge change. And progress is being made.
So I think you've said what some of the most difficult times were. I mean, I imagine seeing, a child and their father that you've been teaching lying in a coffin. I mean, I imagine that would be the most difficult.
It's devastating.
But what were some of the best times that you had while you were there?
Some of the best times. Well, when the children gave me in the endless parties they would give me for my birthday, and the celebrations and the dancing and all the little cards they made for me and all the little speeches. Thank you, Miss Susie. Thank you for everything we've done. And in fact, I'll read you the prologue to my book, which is exactly one such case. Can I read you the prologue?
Sure.
Okay. So this is the sort of thing that happened frequently, but this is the prologue to my memoir. I sit beneath green shade cloth at a table festooned with crepe paper. Behind me, a painted sheet has been fastened to the wall, adorned with red, blue, green, and yellow letters. On the cement patio, 250 raven-haired children gather in their class groups, from tiny 3-year-olds in pigtails and pocketed aprons to senior primary students, some in school uniforms, worn but neat, others in old tracksuits. I grin and wave as ebony eyes, wide with excitement, catch mine, and smiles light up radiant faces burnt dark by harsh desert wind and sun. Beyond the open school gate, a drab wasteland sprawls over arid hills dotted with half-built shacks and stones piled into makeshift walls. Between them, parched valleys sag under heaps of refuse, plastic bags spilling their rotting contents beneath the relentless sun. I look away from the dust and desolation to mighty El Misti, the still active volcano with a personality of his own. His perfect cone rises to almost 6,000 meters as he sits, marooned among his wasted foothills, watching the voracious illegal settlements clawing their way ever higher into his ravines. The microphone crackles into life and a female voice instructs the children to take their places and prepare for my 60th birthday celebration. Over the following hour, I watch, a queen upon my throne, as the children give short speeches and present me with their handmade cards. They recite poems, sing songs, and perform folkloric dances in costume until finally they bring out a huge cake. In the local tradition, I plunge my face into it, hands behind my back, and resurface, doing my best to lick off the sweet cocoa while continuing to breathe. Luckily, a serviette appears as the torta is carried off to be cut into hundreds of pieces. Children and teachers alike line up to give me a kiss and a wish. Starting with kindergarten, I kneel as tiny warm arms encircle my neck with shy murmurs. I love you, Miss Susie. I stand as I progress to the primary children and crouch down so little cheeks touch mine. Thank you for such fun English classes. I straighten for the hugs from the tallest and the teachers. I have learned so much from your training sessions. May God bless you for all you have done for us. Any age-induced twinges fade as I bask in over 250 cuddles. Standing by the new classrooms built with funds raised from a network of generous supporters, I deliver a speech of thanks in careful Spanish. The audience listens attentively. Children, teachers and mothers, many with babies in colourful blankets slung over their backs. When I finish, they applaud, and as I smile at them, my thoughts drift off to when I turned 50 in another existence as a settled, married French teacher living on Sydney's North Shore. Today, I've just given an address in a newly learned language at Colegio Elohim, a school on the dusty outskirts of a remote Andean town where I've lived for the past 6 years. how on earth did this happen? And those were the best moments, when I would just sit there and think, I can't believe I've done this. Cannot believe I've done this. And that was when I'd been there 6 years, and I stayed 12. And I would sit there and I think, I can't believe that I have been here for 12 years and I've done it. I've actually done it. I've realized all those dreams. So those were the best moments, the best moments.
So just a time of reflecting of all those dreams of, as you said at the beginning, of sitting with your father and hearing the stories of your father was telling you, and all those things, and not so the microwave wasn't beeping.
No, it wasn't indeed. No. And so it was a wonderful thing. It was not without its dangers. I had some terrible experiences. I was kidnapped in a false taxi and held under a blanket blindfolded for 17 hours. I was attacked in the street and strangled and left unconscious. I had some awful health issues, which were, just all that more scary, because I was a long way away from Sydney, from home, where I sort of knew the network. So it was scary. It was not without its dangers, but moments like that and the spiritual healing that I went through was just magnificent. I mean, when my marriage ended, I started meditation. I started two things the week after my husband left, jazz ballet and meditation, and both continued. The dance continued in Peru, and so did meditation extraordinarily. The dance was, I was very lucky. There was this wonderful club just down the road from where I lived. And of course, where I lived was a wonderful little spot, a very ancient little village area in Arequipa, which was just lovely, which I describe at length in this book. And of course, this picture on the front of the book where hummingbirds dance, that was my view from my kitchen window. There was a jacaranda, and the hummingbirds used to come and hover in the jacaranda, and I could actually look out and also almost be in the jacaranda looking at the hummingbirds. I mean, things like that were just wonderful. But this club just down the road from where I lived, I was able to join it. I was very privileged, I know, but I couldn't have survived there without it. And there I could do things like swimming and running, but the best of all was dancing. And I joined the dance classes, and I made so many friends. And the instructor, Emilio, I called him in the book. He was the same age as my son, and look, we just had such fun. And I learned how to dance. I learned all the Latin dancing and the zumba and the salsa and all this. And we used to do performances to audiences, which was just hilarious. And I performed traditional dances with some of my friends, because Peruvians are always dancing. And one of my friend's 50th birthday parties, we all danced for her. We rehearsed for weeks, and we did a dance for her, and I did a traditional dance in the whole Peruvian get up with the feather and everything. Asaya, it was called. And again, we rehearsed for weeks at a traditional religious festival. So those were wonderful, wonderful moments. Also, they're just getting back to the spiritual healing too. I met Patty, who the book is dedicated to, a wonderful figure. And she taught me Tai Chi. She's a much older lady, an Arequipian, but she'd spent a lot of her time in the United States. And she taught me Tai Chi, and so I did that. And I'm still very close to her. We talk often on the Zoom. And so doing Tai Chi in her garden, looking up over the volcano, was a magical experience. So there were lots of wonderful experiences there, which made up for the not so wonderful.
But it's life lived, to the fullest.
Absolutely.
I mean,
oh yes.
In all its dimensions.
Oh yes, in every way. Yes.
And so from there, coming back to Sydney, why did you make the decision to leave and come back to Sydney? And then two questions. And then how was it when you came back to Sydney?
Well, I used to come back to Sydney, quite frequently, sort of not every year, but I would often come back for a couple of months, many years. And the main thing I just loved about coming back to Sydney was being able to turn on the tap and drink the water and being able to wash my lettuce, wash my salad in water from the tap. Because the water in Arequipa is fatal. It's just terrible. I mentioned sickness. I would always get very sick, at least once every year. I boiled my water and so on, but it was just really, really very, very dangerous, the water there. So the drinking water was one of the things I just loved about being in Sydney. I loved coming back. I would see my kids, which was always great, and my friends. And when I came back to live, which was just over a year ago, I came home. The reason I decided to come back, so a number of things happened. First of all, at the school, I achieved the big goal, apart from the new building, the new school, which is now a beautiful, sleek building, which we funded the building. Had the staff was settled, and I put on my library. That was my big dream, was to have a library, because the kids in Peru, they're not encouraged. Well, the kids in traditional education, in Peru are not encouraged to sort of lie around in a library reading. You read for school and you sit at a desk, and I had this dream of this library where there'd be cushions where the kids could lie around and read and so on. And so with the help of a wonderful Rotary Club in the United States, which is another connection again, which I mention in my book, Patty, who taught me Tai Chi, she's a revered senior citizen now of Arequipa. In her younger days, she was a tennis champion, and her tennis champion partner was became a doctor, and he lives in America with his American wife. But over the past 50 years, he's come back to Arequipa 75 times with medical missions, and they have built the burns unit of the Arequipa General Hospital to a state-of-the-art facility. And Patty introduced me to him, and he became terribly passionate about Elohim. And he and his wife visit frequently, and they have contacts with Rotary. And so through their Rotary clubs, they raised enough money for me to be able to buy a lot of the books for the library. And a friend of mine, an American friend of mine who lives in Australia, who I used to teach with, she said, go to Scholastic. They have the best Spanish books. So I went to Scholastic, and they did. They had all these gorgeous books for primary in Spanish. So I went through and ordered all these books, and then Rotary paid for them, and we got them delivered. And that was, they got stuck in customs, and getting anything sent to Peru is a nightmare. But eventually they arrived. And then a group of Rotarians came over from America and covered the books. And that was just the greatest fun. They all sat up there in the library covering books. They had competitions to see who could cover the most. It was very funny. So they were wonderful. And so that was tremendous. And then I finally got my cushions and my mats and my shelves. And I created this library. We created this library. And so the parents, we instigated parent days where the parents, because the parents were very frightened of coming into school. Oh, you don't come into school. We encouraged them to come in, to take part in classes on open days, a la Western model. And one of the greatest joys, and I've got photos of it all over Facebook and my website, of parents coming in and sitting with their children and looking at books, because most of them can't read, but the children reading books to their parents.
Oh.
And a mother with her little baby, and she sat her down, and I got a little baby's book, and I started showing to the baby, and the mother said, "Oh, that's nice." I said, no, babies start reading when they're babies. And so she was just astonished. And so she sat there, and there was the baby going at the little book. Moments like that were wonderful. And so I had achieved my library. Rosa's daughter had come on board, and she's a very, very clever, young, computer savvy, university educated young woman, and she'd come on board because I was very worried about a succession plan. She'd come on board as vice president administrator to help Rosa. So I felt that things had got to a point at the school where, much had been achieved. I had 2 little grandchildren, and I realized that I needed to come back because otherwise I was going to lose touch with my own family, with my kids. And so it wasn't a matter, it was really, for a couple of years, it was a matter of not if, but when. And then in 2019, last year, I got extra sick, extra quickly. I went back in April, and I was sick within 8 days with a hideous thing. And then 2 weeks later, I got another hideous thing, which was a really, really nasty flu. And I just lay there sweating and thinking, Susie, I think your planets are aligning. I think it's time you went home. And so I made a decision, and I decided to come via England. I came home. I went to England to do more walking and more research on my book. And then I came home. And it was definitely, well, given what happened after that, it was a inspired decision to come home when I did, because the school and Peru, but particularly the school, have suffered terribly through COVID. It's just been awful, really awful. So I've been very lucky that I've been here rather than there.
So what you as a person, from that moment, that evening when your husband said that he was leaving, and where you are now, what are the differences in you as a person? How all those experiences changed you?
I'm much more accepting that there are other ways of doing things or other ways of interpreting things besides my way. I am much more relaxed. Well, especially since I can say this now that I've done all this, that I've had this extraordinary 12 years and faced down so many demons and so many fears and done so much. I can say that I'm pretty relaxed now. I mean, yes, I've done it. So I'm much more relaxed, much more accepting. And I think the biggest thing that I've learned is to try and look at the big picture. That whenever anything happens, sort of fairly momentous happens, be it good or be it bad, that there may be more to it than I think. There's something more to this. I just have to find it. And I think that's probably the greatest change that's happened in me. Something happens and I'll think, no, that doesn't necessarily mean that. Look further, look beyond yourself, look beyond the way you interpret it. There are other interpretations out there. You've just got to find them. Does that make any sense?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
The big difference.
And so many of the people that I interview say go through situations that are, real crises situations or breakdowns or depression or burnout. And it's often in those moments where it's exactly what you're saying, that it's, this is a bad time to pass through, but it's telling you something, it's teaching you something. And that it's in those times that you need to look for what is it teaching you.
Exactly. Yes.
And I could imagine you might also just feel unbelievably proud.
I'm pretty chuffed, I must admit that. I feel extraordinarily fortunate, and I mean that sounds like a cliche, but I do feel extraordinarily fortunate that I have been able to do what I did. Now, for example, my parents were both well and truly deceased before all of this happened. So I haven't had to stay around to look after aging and unwell parents. I'm sure a lot of my friends would have loved to have gone and done what I've done, but they've been stuck at home with responsibilities. I have been extraordinarily fortunate in that I haven't had that. My grandchildren have only, weren't around, hadn't arrived. My children weren't married, and they weren't, in stable partnerships and so on when all this happened. So the timing, I was extraordinarily lucky with the timing. Having said that, I also got out and, embraced it and ran with it and took off. And I know that did take quite a lot of courage to do that, also a certain amount of insanity, but that's just my imagination. But I feel basically terribly fortunate that I was able to pull it off. Very, very proud, I suppose. Do I feel proud? Grateful would be, and that's again sounds cliched, but I just feel grateful that I was given the opportunity to be able to do what I did. And very satisfied rather than proud, satisfied that I was able to use the skills that I had to bring about what I brought about. Yes.
Makes such a huge difference in the lives of so many children.
Yes, I think we did. I think we really did. And another thing that I didn't realise until I'd been there quite some time was the effect that just me being me and the way that I lived had on people. It was a long time before I had the confidence to share things with the kids. But especially with secondary, as I became more confident, I was able to share with them, opinions on birth control, comparisons between them and my own children, explaining to them how things were in my country, and actually being able to present to them a world beyond the slums of Arequipa. And in the library again helped hugely with this. I was able, there were pictures all over from, calendars of Australia, calendars of America, calendars of Africa. There were globes all over the place to sort of try and encourage them and to learn that there was a world outside this little world. So I think the way that I was had quite an amount of influence, which surprised me. And as I got more confident of that, even my meditation, we used to, in the library, we used to do deep breathing and meditation with the children. They're priceless. They'd close their eyes and they'd breathe in and they'd breathe out. But some of them you could see visibly relaxing because the stress those kids bring with them from home every day, the situations that they leave behind. I mean, again, what in this book you'll read stories which will just make your hair stand on end of the abuse that these kids suffer. And then they come to school carrying it all with them. So being able to teach them a little bit about relaxation and healthy eating, trying to just influence them was a surprise to me. But it was very gratifying. Yes.
Two questions, just as we bring this to an end. Firstly, where can people get hold of your books?
Yes. Well, the books have both just been re-released and they're in hard copy. Now I can give you a website which will get you straight to the fundraising page through which you can buy. And I can also give you my website which can take you on to the same information. So how shall I start? What about straight to the books?
Yeah, straight to the books, yeah.
Okay, so it's https://booksale-gdg-728n Raisley, that's RAISELY.com/.
Okay. And then you've got your own website, do you?
Yes, I do. That is, there are two of them, but the author one, Which one shall I give you? I'll give you the school one. I'm just trying to read it here in the semi-dark. www.elohimarequipa.org. And that's ELOHIMAREQUIPA.org.
That's great. Well, I'll put those in the notes as well so that people can,
Wonderful.
if they want to find the book, they can find it.
Yes, and I can send them to you.
That's great. And just the last question I want to ask, Susi, is, your life is I would say of itself a message to people who are listening. But if you had a particular message that you wanted to give to listeners, what would that be?
I think what I said, whenever something happens, think to yourself, there's more to this, and I've just got to find it.
That's a great message, a very positive message for in a way that we live our lives. So thank you so much, Susi. I mean, it's been wonderful hearing from your books. It's been wonderful hearing your story. It's been amazing hearing about the work that you've done and the courage that you had to do that and just follow your dream. And it makes me feel, gosh, how can we change things in those slums? How can the world come together to get rid of those piles of rubbish, to help those children, to give them the mental health support that they need? How can we together do that? So I don't have the answers to that. I don't know if anybody has, but it inspires me to think, let's together, address these problems.
Well, it starts with the government of the country. That's where it starts. There's only so much that foreigners can do. It has to start with the government of the country and the state of politics in those countries. As you well know, it's very challenging. It's very, very challenging.
Okay, thank you so much, Susi.
Thank you very much, Cecilia. It's been an absolute pleasure.
I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Brave New Women. From the 5th of February, I will be running a masterclass called Empowering Women to Find Their Voice. If you'd like to join us, you can contact me on LinkedIn, on the Brave New Women Facebook page, or via my website. Thanks for listening.